Hello. Thank you so much, Vincent, for agreeing to interview with the Slingers Collective. Let's just start with the question first, without any further ado. So my first question is actually about your previous book. So the main focus of this conversation is about your last book, If We Burn, but I start with the Jakarta method. And the Jakarta method is slightly different, in a different topic. It's about basically Washington Project during Cold War and how Indonesia and the political left project in Indonesia was crushed. You also pointed out other countries like Brazil and some other country in Africa. So how come you write If We Burn after Jakarta method? Do you see any similarity between the two books?
Yes, I think that they're both about the global system at different points in history. The Jakarta method I started working on in 2017 when I was living in Jakarta. And that is about the period after World War II to the end of the Cold War, to the fall of the Soviet Union. And it is about the mass murder of leftists or people accused of being leftists by usually authoritarian capitalist governments, either receiving direct assistance from the United States or tacit assistance or tacit approval from the United States. So one way to see this is to see If We Burn is as an indirect sequel, a kind of unofficial sequel, because the Jakarta method is about the construction of US-led capitalist hegemony in the 20th century. And If We Burn is about the next period in world history, the period that comes as I think what is called the end of history. I think it's not even really wrong to consider maybe 1989 and 2011 as the end of history. And then the If We Burn begins in a world system shaped by the collapse of the Second World, by the intense and brutal neoliberalization of what used to be called the Third World. And it is about the beginnings of attempts to fight back against or to reshape that system. Now, attempts that have been largely unsuccessful so far. But I do think that they're at least chronologically sequential. And I think you also can't really understand the forms of resistance that many movements in the 2010s took without understanding the concrete decimation of left-wing organizations, of trade union movements, and other well-structured social and political movements in the 20th century. So I do think they're related, but I actually did start working on this book first. I've been working on this book since before the Jakarta method came out, because it starts with a personal experience that I have as a journalist back in 2013 in Brazil.
Oh, thank you. So it's important for us because Jakarta method is actually translated in Farsi, so a lot of our audience can read this book. But let's move on to the focus of this interview, If We Burn. So as far as I understand, that one of the key point, or only probably the main key point of the book, is the failure of the process 2010. And why failure? Because a lot of this process movement that you pointed out in your book didn't result in a revolution or in substantial change. Not only that, but also bring about a situation worse than the one it was before. Mm-hmm. And so basically, I would like to start with the summary of the book. Why do you think they failed? And if that characterization or correct in your opinion?
Mm-hmm. So what I tried to do with this book, as you say, is to focus on mass protests that got so large that they led to moments of apparent victory or euphoric breakthroughs. I tried to write the history of the 2010s as if the most important thing to happen in that decade is mass protests that generate maybe revolutionary conditions, that generate real possibilities, that were experienced by a lot of the people covering them, a lot of people living through them, as a real breakthrough, as you know, it's happening. We're doing it. But then if you go back a few years later and look at what actually happened, not only do you not have a type of revolution, no matter how you might have imagined it, how the original participants might have imagined it, you often have these movements being hijacked, taken advantage of, manipulated, kidnapped, crushed by forces that were often worse than the ones that were the target of these uprisings initially. So we have a strange situation in which, as far as we know, these things are hard to count. You can't really count these things. But as far as we know, more people took part in protests in the 2010s than at any other point in human history, exceeding 1960s, which would have been the last, the record, the global record. And so I try to construct this history around that phenomenon, a protest that gets so big that it becomes something else. And that's a crucial phenomenon. That's a crucial part of my answer, which I'm getting to. And around that question, how is it possible that so many things felt like euphoric victory, but then either led to nothing or something worse than the original situation? And that wasn't the case always, but it happened enough to I thought that it would make sense to build a work of history around that phenomenon and around that question. That dynamic, though, of starting as a protest and then getting so big that it becomes something else, I think is quite important to the answer to your actual question. Because what we saw in all of the cases that I looked at, what began as a protest almost always planned and organized by people that did not really expect things to take off. They were not planning for or even really hoping for the numbers of people to pour into the movements that they ended up seeing. The unexpected influx of people into a particular type of protest either overthrew a government or made it impossible for existing government to continue with business as usual. They so destabilized an existing set of elites that set of elites wanted to give something to the streets, wanted to hold on to power, was willing to give some concessions to the movement. But it turned out that these opportunities that were generated by this very specific type of protest, this very specific configuration of tactics and ideologies and approaches to opposing elite power, a protest, and especially a protest of this type, turned out to be very poorly suited for taking advantage of these opportunities. A protest of this type could not enter a power vacuum and form a new government. Certainly not a protest of this particular type, in which often the people had come together so quickly that they didn't agree on much except that they were in this protest together. And there was no mechanism for collectively deciding who actually would form the new government, of what type. So often in this first situation, when there was an actual power vacuum, the protest movement watched in horror as somebody else did fill it. And as a rule, the people that filled that vacuum were people that had already been organized, had established some either had some access to power beforehand, or had the kind of nimble and well-functioning organization that could move quickly and take advantage of a power vacuum. And then in the other situation, the less pronounced situation, the one where the government's not overthrown, but willing to give something to the streets in the way that, let's say there's workers go on strike and the boss comes to the conclusion, it's really better to get these people back to work than to fight them directly. What do they want? In that situation, it turned out that this particular type of protest was even unable to elaborate what it was that they wanted, that would allow the existing elites to come to the conclusion that, okay, it's better for me to give them this thing, and we can all kind of walk away pretending that we're winners, even though I've actually lost. And in that situation, often, and in some cases, the elites really did want to help the streets. They wanted to be on the side of the people somehow or another in more democratic cases. In other cases, they didn't, but they would have done it. But that couldn't happen. There was no way to figure out what that was, and there was no reason to believe in the manner that a boss would believe about a striking union, that if they give A, B, and C, then things will go back to normal. So often in this case, energy dissipates because there's no structure holding the movement together, nothing's happening, people get tired and they go home. Or, depending on the configuration, the constitution of a particular ruling class, they may ultimately just decide for repression, come to the conclusion that I can't give these people what they want, I'm just going to crush them. And then they can't fight back because, again, it's very difficult for a protest of people that came together very quickly that is not composed of well-organized forces to withstand a counter-revolution. So this history looks at many different countries, and every case is different, but that's the way I can sort of summarize an approach to understanding how things went so wrong in so many of them.
Okay, so you comment on basically a lot of factors of why the protest movement, you look at the books and probably some other that you haven't looked, have failed. So I'm going through some of those factors one by one and try to basically expand it and unfold it. And so one of the things that you really talk about in your book is the issue with the leaderness. Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned now there was all of these protests that there was no one's particularly ready to take over the power. And in a lot of cases, there were practical reasons for being leaderless. I can assume that in Hong Kong, no one wants to say that I'm a leader because it would be very dangerous, or in a kind of suppressive regime. But at the same time, if you don't have a leader, as you mentioned, it's create a vacuum and always, most of the time, filled by the forces that you don't want to be forced. At least the protester doesn't want to be forced. So I would like you to expand a little bit in the challenges and the constraint by this kind of decentralized, leaderless protest movement. And my key question is, do you think this kind of leaderless, decentralized protest movement can ever realize a substantial change? I guess it's $1 million question, but
Well, since this is a work of history, the answer becomes a little bit easier to formulate because I can look at what things have actually happened in the entire history of humanity. At the end of this book, I construct this book through 200 to 250 interviews that I carried out in 12 countries over 4 years. I'll get a lot of different answers from different people based on differing circumstances. The thing that I heard probably most as to what we wish we had done differently, what is a reason for why things went wrong. And I heard this on left and right. I heard this amongst the sort of radical socialist people from the radical socialist tradition, people that are right of center. The thing that I heard the most was we were too decentralized. So what has tended to happen historically is that in large enough groups of people, whether or not they claim that they are leaderless or that they are very intentional about having leaders, a leader tends to emerge. A leader appears. And that leader is often very easy to identify, even if there's an ideology of we don't have any leaders. But if you can go to the space, you can realize, well, it's him and her, right? And there's a very short and insightful, very incisive essay about this called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which was written by Jo Freeman in the 1970s. She's a US feminist activist that had worked in leaderless spaces for a very long time, and she came to that conclusion basically, is that if you insist that you don't have a structure will be imposed upon you, but it'll be a structure that you don't choose. It is a set of leadership. It is power will be handed out in ways that cannot be controlled by the group itself. And this is often what happened in the 2010s. What happened in the 2010s is that sometimes there was concrete leaderlessness because it was very difficult to figure out who would be a leader. Egypt would be a case where there wasn't necessarily a strong ideology of we are committed to leaderlessness and horizontalism. It's that this thing came together very, very, very quickly. And so there was concrete horizontality, there was concrete leaderlessness for a while. And then in other cases, there was real commitment to this idea of leaderlessness. Brazil was a case. This is the case that I lived through. There was a group that was explicitly committed to never having any kind of hierarchy whatsoever. And so I'm open to the possibility that in the future you can see a very different type of uprising that somehow actually transforms society at every level, ideologically and materially, in which you do not have new structures emerging that are analogous to the ones that we have now. But historically, when there is a power vacuum, especially if there's something really good to be, there's something very valuable, something very attractive to powerful actors sitting right there on the table, historically someone has always come in to snatch it. And this is especially true when you're very far from the imperial core, when you're not the United States, when you're a country that has more powerful neighbors than you, when you're a country that has to respond to hegemonic reactions to some kind of a revolution. And again, historically, after a revolution, even the most successful ones, there's a counter-revolution. And historically, if there is not some kind of an order that is selected organically, democratically by the thing itself, the people say, okay, this is the person that we're behind. Martin Luther King is the person leading this particular march today. We do support this party in the establishment of a transitional government. You get the imposition of leadership, which is often more violent. You get someone like Sisi pretending like he is the representative of the legacy of the 2011 revolution in Egypt, without having actually asked anybody, just imposing that narrative upon a group of people. So the degree to which people believed in leaderlessness, or there was just kind of people like me from the global media showing up and celebrating it because it looked leaderless, because it makes it easier for us to see what we want to see, that varied. But at least historically, you get the imposition of some kind of structure. And often interviewees told me that it's better to choose democratically the structure than to have it imposed upon you. And that doesn't mean you have to swing the pendulum all the way back to a single, like, the leader for life. I mean, a lot of the organizations that acted as sort of foils to the protesters in Brazil, for example, they have collective leadership, or they have rotating leadership, or a union representative is rotated in and out in accordance with the votes of the participants. But some kind of mechanism for a large group of people, allowing for a smaller group of people to truly represent them, not just to pretend to represent them. Because I think fundamentally what we're dealing with in the end of history period from 1990 to 2011, and then what we're trying to solve, is the crisis of representation. The fact that everybody knows, and I think this powers right populist resurgence, this powers all kinds of movements of different stripes around the world, this knowledge that the elites that are supposed to represent us, they don't actually represent us in the thick, full sense, right? They say they do, but we have no power over what they do. We got to a point where representation is just if you go to a movie and there's somebody that likes the same music as you or looks like you. So that is what has happened historically. I don't want to close the door on new types of thinking or imagining new futures, but historically, someone has either snatched power or imposed some kind of a structure on an apparently structureless movement.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask specifically about tyranny of a structureless, but you commented on that. So move on to the point that you just bring it up now is the representation and the social media at the same time. So what exactly does representation exactly mean? Is a question. So one might say a political organization, should have representation so that it give an interview with the media, etc., etc. One might say we need a representation. As a result of that, we should have an organization. So the first one, it has a kind of a media perspective to the political activism. The latter is organization is a center point of the representation. So my question is basically, what do you mean by having a representation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think thick representation, full representation of the type that I just mentioned, I would distinguish from a thin or a representation which does not allow for control by the represented. So the representation of the democratic and ideal type that I think that makes the most participants in a given social movement or uprising or political party feel most of the time like their outcomes have been achieved, that they are happy with the results, is representation which can not only happen vis-a-vis media, but happen in spaces of mediation, right? So again, this is a simplified analogy, but to a union representative, you might have somebody that's talking to the media. You might have somebody that is standing at the front of the picket line whose job is to be, has a special role in street actions and mobilizations. And then you might have another person whose job it is behind the scenes to be negotiating, to extracting concessions, extracting the real victories. Or if you have much, much more lofty goals, if you don't want to just extract concessions, a group of people that's ready to become the transitional government, right? A group of people that's ready to form a new state that is truly representative of the people. And that representation, I think the true representation it consists of a power that is granted. It is when a group of people decide collectively, okay, we are going to give Iran the power to do X in our name, and we're going to watch very carefully what is done, and we can decide to change that if we would like. So I think, in the fullest sense, it is a power that is granted by the people at the bottom of an organization, or not the bottom, but the people that by the base, all of the members, to do a specific thing in a specific way, and to make decisions on the fly. But we're going to watch, and we can take it away if we like. I think that would be full or thick representation. It can happen vis-a-vis many other actors. You can have people, in the anti-colonial struggles in Portuguese-speaking African countries, you had people that were leading guerrilla formations, and you had people active diplomatically. You had people that were working on the ground to command local guerrilla units. You had people over here that were ready to take over the state if you could actually weaken the state enough to get the Portuguese to run away. And you had people representing the movement in international fora, at the UN, in the United States, in Portugal. And these are all different types of representation that can add up to putting pressure on the group of elites that you want to challenge, and then either transforming their power or replacing it in moments of victory.
So you just mentioned historical cases for division of labor, and how is more effective in an organization. Actually, you divide the kind of tasks that the organization should do. At the same time, you comment a lot about this kind of participatory decision-making process, which is good in a sense that because empowering every individual in a political organization, but at the same time, it's making them parallel. So you made an example of some of this protest movement. It takes hours and hours to make a simple decision. They cannot recruit more. In the case of Brazil, if I remember correctly, they cannot recruit new members because they were so overwhelmed and everyone doing everything, but at the same time, it's not clear which person does what. So my question is basically, of course, these people chose to do this in response to the traditional or kind of a Leninist style of movement. There is a good reason for that. And in the beginning of your book, you go through that historical reason why these people decided to do so. But at the same time, we see what we saw. So how do you propose to, take an approach that provide a balance between the participatory decision-making, at the same time we ensure that we actually make a decision? And what do you think? Again, This is a difficult question.
It's an easy answer, but it's so easy that it's going to appear to be an easy answer. And the answer is to figure out what works in real struggles, to figure out what works in concrete situations, in interactions with the powerful forces that you hope to combat. That's an easy answer, but I'll say more to explain what I actually mean, because in the case of Brazil that you mentioned, they were fully committed to consensus-based decision-making. They were very, very committed to, a lot of them would now say they were dogmatically committed to horizontalist organizing practices, which meant that everybody got to have a long discussion about every single decision that was made. And this often for them meant 12, 14, 16-hour meetings until they could get everybody to agree to a particular tactic. For them, for a while, that worked. because they were a group of 30 or 40 people. They all knew each other very well. They had disagreements, but they all agreed on the big things that, we're left anarchists, we're autonomists, and we want to improve public transportation for the working class of Brazil. And this worked for 8 years very well. The challenges that this organizational form ran into came as a result of their own victory, the victory that they created, of the opportunities that they unleashed after their initial goal was achieved. So for 8 years, they were able to, because they were small enough, spend a lot of time. I mean, this is a very specific type of person that wants to spend 30 hours a week discussing transportation protest tactics, but they just happen to be those type of people, and it worked out for them. But two things happened as they set a fire that was much, much larger than the one they expected to set. They actually wanted to set it, but they didn't expect it to really happen, I think. One, they couldn't change tactics quickly, because now we have to decide an entirely new mission. For 8 years, we've been trying to do one thing. We did it. What's our new mission? There was no way that they could take advantage of that opportunity in the time that was available to them. And then also, this was a very strange thing that was unexpected. Thousands of Brazilians wanted to join their group, wanted to be a part of the thing that they had created. Now, they could not let in 1,000 new people and give everyone equal decision-making rights. I mean, they were those people, without trying to, were kind of calling the bluff on their ultra-democratic principles, right? Because if you're ultra-democratic, then anybody who shows up should be allowed to vote. But actually, if you just let in 1,000 people, well, now we're not the group that we've created. We're just whoever these people are and whatever they think. So I think that depending on who you are and what you're doing, certain shapes, certain organizational forms can work better or worse for you and what you're trying to achieve. I think in the period of in the end of history, from 1990 to 2011, or in other periods in the 20th century, it became easy to fetishize certain shapes because you weren't actually really in a struggle with the enemy. So you could spend a lot of time thinking, well, if we just get the shape right, then everything will flow later. And so there have been historical movements that have for sure fetishized the construction of an organization that is the exact same as the Bolsheviks at the turn of the 20th century. Then there have been groups that fetishized the sort of inverse shape.
Prefigurative ones. Yeah,
the fully horizontal, absolutely anti-hierarchical, and often defined, and also one aspect of this anti-Leninist tendency is a rejection of the idea of the state as a goal. We reject the idea that we're going to either take over or transform the state. But it's easy to get into it's easy and understandable, I think, to get into the habit of fetishizing a certain geometric formation when you're not actually in battle. When you get into battle, now it really matters. Now you can figure out what starts to work better. You can see which things work and which do not work, and it starts to become very clear that, having the perfect shape now is less important than winning this battle. And so as I think the end of history period ended, you can start to look at which things do work. And I think that probably most of the most responsible analyses of the current situation say that not that many things work that well, but a bunch of things work all right. So to be more open to different organizational forms based on their effectiveness, not how much they correspond to this ideal type of this drawing of the perfect organization that we have over here.
Thank you. So I move a bit to the topic that you touched in the beginning of this interview, social media. So you're a journalist. I guess you have a lot to say about media in general. But my particular question is about social media and or if you have some comment on the traditional media, it is fine. So I guess we can agree on the fact that social media is important. It helps to shaping a protest. It helps to basically make it a better exposure. And we all know that there was a lot of hype around 2009 to 2010 around social media. Even I remember in the book you There is this from Gordon Brown. There's this quote from Gordon Brown, which is quite relevant to the. It was what it was. If we had Facebook during the Rwanda genocide,
he basically said genocide can't happen anymore because of the internet, because everybody would find out it was happening, and in the end of history liberal brain, if you raise enough awareness of a bad thing, the bad thing must stop, right? You can't have everybody know about a bad thing and then it continues to happen. Whereas one thing that we've learned that was very brutally impressed upon us in the 2010s is bad things can definitely continue to happen. Even the whole world can know about them. Gordon Brown was one of the most, one of the most outrageous elaborators of this kind of techno-optimism.
So especially in the current climate is like a huge joke to me. But anyway, so there was a lot of hype, and I'm not sure if we actually passed on that in a sense. Of course, as you mentioned in this interview and also quite substantially in your book, it can redirect the social protest to the places that the protesters themselves they don't want to end up. Also, it's kind of it's so vulnerable to suppression, like in the case of Hong Kong again. They have this big Telegram group, if I remember correctly, that everyone could be member of that Telegram group, and even the enemy of those protesters could be member of that. So it is quite problematic from even security reason. But my specific question is regard to the myth of we can solely organize via social media, and the so-called Facebook revolution back in the days,
right,
I guess now we are in the TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, or X kind of revolution era. Yeah. How we can characterize this? Do you think that we can solely organize via social network?
You can, but then you're going to be incredibly vulnerable to misrepresentation, and it's going to be very, very difficult for energy to be sustained past the initial moment of, I'm mad about this post that I saw. If the only thing holding together a movement is that we all saw the same post and we got mad about it, historically, once more, this dissipates very, very quickly when conditions change. After a few days, a few weeks on the streets, if nothing is achieved, there's nothing left. It's hard to even find the people that will say, oh yeah, I went to that protest. They might even say, oh, I didn't. So back in 2009, 2011, there was a narrative, it was quite widely shared, but it was especially prominent in the kind of publications that I've always worked for, dominant corporate media in the most powerful country in the global system, English-speaking mainstream media. The narrative back then was that these revolutions are all about social media, and that's good. The conclusion that I come to after trying to put together, reconstruct the history of this decade, is that this was partially about social media, and to the extent that it's true, that's bad. The social media facilitated a more rapid quantitative scaling up of street movements in the 2010s, and that was part of what generated some of the possibilities in the 2010s. But to the extent that it relied on purely digital organizing rather than the other kinds of things that, for example, Asef Bayat talks about in the pre-existing organic networks of the streets. To the extent that we're talking about purely digital organization, this is not the best way to get people to come together. So once more, in my book, I only talk about cases that got so large they either overthrew a government or fundamentally destabilized it, made business as usual impossible, at least for a short period of time. For that to happen, you always need many reasons. You have multiple causalities always at work when we're talking about this kind of an uprising. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 reasons. And if you want to ask about any of the 12 cases in the book, I could probably come up with 5 or something. I think that the response to the 2008 financial crisis is one of them in almost every case. And social media is one of them in almost every case too. Social media is what gets you over the line. It helps you to get big enough that you create this new set of opportunities. But now simplifying and exaggerating, let's take the most extreme version of a a digitally coordinated uprising. Everybody, because in the paradigmatic social movements, protest movements of the 20th century, the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States, which was so important for forging a new repertoire of contention, not only in the West, but inspiring a new way, like creating movements that contributed to global contention in the 1960s. If you look back at the way that the Black Civil Rights Movement in the United States organized in the 50s and 60s, it often took months, if not years, to put together a single action. You had to get all of these people to know each other. You had to get them integrated into the same organization. You had to get them to plan a very particular action. They often selected who was going to do what. There was quite a lot of internal discipline. But it takes and then it took a very long time to get in contact with all the authorities to put up all these flyers. We're going to do this on this day. By 2011, again, an exaggerated, simplified version of the story, everybody can see a shocking post at 11 a.m. and be on the streets by noon. Except the only thing that they have in common is that they've seen the same post. So if, again, in the most exaggerated case, that this group of people actually causes the dictator to flee to Saudi Arabia, it becomes very difficult for this type of a group of people with no coordination whatsoever, except for the fact that they all saw the same thing on the internet, to come to an agreement as to what to do with this opportunity. And this type of digital coordination never happens entirely on social media, right? So it's always a combination of social media and Al Jazeera and the New York Times. These things all work together. And for the kind of rapid scaling up that we saw in the 2010s, this can only happen because of a positive media feedback loop, a positive loop of sympathetic media representation that happens on both social media and traditional media. And if you're really relying on this, you're incredibly vulnerable to the way that prominent media actors view you. Because if they like what you're doing, but concretely, there's a million different people with a million different ideas as to what they're doing there, powerful media actors can show up and find the person that says what they want to hear, or says that what their audience wants to hear. And we saw this dynamic in uprisings in North Africa, certainly. The Egyptians were often represented by spokespersons that were selected by prominent media representatives, either active on social media or traditional media. But then at the other end of the spectrum, if dominant voices in media, social and traditional, don't like you, it's very easy for them to find the stupidest or most ridiculous or most irresponsible, or often just somebody that's sent in by the FBI or MI5, so like an actual literal agent provocateur that's sent in there to say something stupid. Then they can take this one thing and be like, that's what the movement is. And a movement that is purely digitally coordinated does not have any mechanism for saying, no, it's not. So these are sets of weaknesses that come after the moments of opportunity created by this quantitative upscaling that happened in the social media era.
So while we're still in the topic of media, so you're talking about the importance of not only relying on the social media in a sense, but I think with the environment we are in, basically celebrity activism is a thing. The neoliberal subjectivity is prevalent everywhere. And we were discussing before this interview, and that how celebrity activists not necessarily don't believe on what they say, but it works. They are very effective, because of the era that we are in. So my question is, how do you basically see the dynamic between this social media, traditional media, basically traditions, with this new ever-coming growth of neoliberal subjectivity that comes with this celebrity activism? How do you see the balance? How do you see the importance of that in the protest movement that we are having if you are going to have in the future?
Yeah, this is something that came up, and I think the real consequences of it didn't become clear until the end of the decade. But we, in a way that seems paradoxical, but actually the more you think about it, it makes perfect sense, they were often revolts against a neoliberal order carried out in a neoliberal way. And you already pointed to exactly how that works out. Sometimes there's quite a lot of energy, there's quite a lot going on, there's apparently opportunities here, there's quite a lot of attention on this movement. The movement doesn't have the capabilities to either transform the state or extract concessions from existing elites, but you have a lot of individuals who, I think, one generally accepted trait of neoliberal subjectivity is that we are trained to view ourselves as enterprises. Every man and woman is a firm, always grinding, always hustling. You know, I could do 3 hours driving Uber after this interview, and I could, like, my capital is going to go up. And so in this situation where there's no available, it is not readily apparent how this uprising can transform the state or replace it with something better. There are opportunities for personal branding. There's opportunities for building a media career. There's opportunities for trying to get famous, because this is something that everybody knows works. You know, we have no mechanism for going to sit down with the Egyptian military. Well, this is different. Let's use the United States. This movement has no way to go sit down behind the scenes and sort of tell Donald Trump that he better give us A, B, C, and D, or else he's in trouble. And we don't have sort of an internal think tank that has already decided that we're willing to accept A, B, C, and D, but we're going to ask for E to raise consciousness about, for example, abolition. But we know that we have a way to try to get A, B, and C from Donald Trump right now. That mechanism is not available. That no one, like, it would be incredibly difficult to take this power and this fire and brimstone and create a bridge to that capability. But I could get rich probably by being a social media influencer. And this, tragically, this did happen, I think, in quite a lot of uprisings. And then, you get other analyses that take this to a deeper level, that an emphasis on an individual choice in a revolutionary movement is itself a reflection of sort of neoliberal or like individualistic subjectivity, because historically, to win a battle against a well-armed and well-prepared adversary, you have to act collectively. I hate war. I hate military stuff. I don't like anything that has to do with military campaigns. But there's a reason that in war, armies tend to be organized a certain way. Guerrilla revolutionary groups tend to be organized a certain way. It's because you have enemies. And I think perhaps another aspect of neoliberal subjectivity was this feeling that, well, I as an individual, I'm a firm and I'm an island and I get to make all my own decisions. And if we raise enough awareness, there's some good guy in power over there that's supposed to sort it out. I don't have to actually go to war with existing elites. We just have to prove that we're right and we have the people on our side. And I kind of maybe as an American deep down believed that 10, 15 years ago, that, if you're clearly right and the people are on your side, that's basically all you need. Tragically, it turned out that's not what you needed. And when there was no path from here to there, this path is right there. It's baked deep into your psyche as an early 21st century subject. If you get famous, if you could maybe start a GoFundMe, you're going to control a lot of resources, and that just like the tactics just like the particular responses to injustice that we saw become hegemonic in the 2010s, they were not only possible, they were apparent, they were readily apparent, they were ready at hand. Everybody knew that you could do a mass street protest in a decentralized and horizontally structured way. Everyone knew that you could do that, so that's what everyone did. Once you got to this moment of extreme opportunity, no one knew how to create a new state or to transform the existing one, but everyone knew how to do personal branding. And you got savvy and often cynical entrepreneurs taking advantage of this attention and this goodwill to either become famous become political commentators. Sometimes political commentators that are good, and I'm glad exist, but the goals had much larger ambitions than creating a new cast of pundits, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because to me it's one of those characterization of end of the world, end of the end of history, is you only try to operate in the space of possibility rather than to opening up new possibilities. So I think it's one of the symptoms of the era. Anyway, so let's take quite the opposite spectrum of this individual subjectivity, assuming that I don't want to be a celebrity activist, etc., etc. I want to be really going through the change where collective organization, and I want to imagine what the society look like, and in the process of resistance, in the process of the fighting, I want to live in that. That's called basically prefigurative, and you touch on your book. And we see that one also, it doesn't work, and there is a lot of limitation to that kind of thinking. And can you expand a little bit, elaborate on what are the limitations of the kind of the prefigurative movement?
Yeah, it's related to the last conversation, the end of the last question that we were just discussing. Prefiguration is something that has been theorized to work in many different ways, and I think it does work in many different ways. On the one hand, if you are showing to the people what you want to do in order to be in contact with the masses or a larger group of the population, that is the type of prefiguration that I think can work in a very concrete, ends-oriented way. So if you are trying to act now in a way that gets more people on your side because you're showing what you want to produce in the future, that's very, I think, effective. And that is, I think, really a kind of a view of it. It's related to vanguardism, because like this famous interpretation of prefiguration comes from André Gorz right after the '68 revolts in Paris, and what he's talking about is Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Is that they overthrew the Batista government, but they didn't automatically win the power to govern society. They had to have demonstrated to the people in the act of carrying out the revolution more or less what they wanted to do. Because if they marched into Havana the day after Batista fled, but everyone hated them, then they're not going to become the new government. They would just get killed by them, right? So in one case, there's a concrete way that prefiguration is effective, is that you get more people to believe in what you're doing and to get behind you and to hopefully grant you thick representation. Of course, a lot of people would disagree that happened in Cuba, but that's where that interpretation comes. Another is it transforms the subjectivity of the people that are involved. It makes the experience of being in the struggle more meaningful, because you get to experience working with your fellow human being in a way that you don't get to do maybe at your job, driving an Uber. And this makes the experience more meaningful. It makes more people want to join, and it changes the way that the militant views the struggle. But there's also another kind of mystical tradition, which you can trace back to Christianity, I think, to interpretations of the Old Testament, trace back to the diggers in England, that is really kind of eschatological. It's really kind of based on this idea that we need to act now like the world is going to be after the break, basically after the Messiah comes. There's this idea that if we just get all the ingredients right now, if we act perfectly democratically now, then there will be a sort of mystical identity between, like, the eschatological break, like the revolution, will act as a mirror, and then you will reflect that into the future. And it happens in this kind of almost a religious way. And like the bumper sticker version, I don't think in the UK, this is a very popular bumper sticker in the United States, especially in California where I grew up, is like that quote from Gandhi, which I think is not a real quote, which is "Be the change that you wish to see in the world," which again is true a lot of the time. But in a revolution, there's usually a counter-revolution. And if someone declares war on you, and you have to go to battle with a well-armed and often brutal enemy, you don't want to act like you've already won. You can't wage a war acting like you already live in the utopia that you want to create in the future. So that is, I think, the limits of the strict. I think just, again, it's an easy answer that I gave earlier, is to consider very carefully what is the strategic relation between this particular tactic and the goals that we have. And if making the encampment more inspiring, more fun, more popular is something you can do with prefigurative practice, all of that makes a lot of sense. But it's a mistake to believe, I think, that necessarily that means you're going to win, or that after victory, whatever that means for you, that the future society will look at anything like what you're doing now.
Thank you. I'm going to, my last question it's a more on strategy and coherent ideology. It's very relevant to what you just explained. So in the book, and now you argue that the lack of coherent ideology and strategy among the protester has impacted the effectiveness of the protest. Of course, I mean, it's stupid to say that there was no strategy, and you didn't say that there was a lot of strategy, clear strategy and a clear tactic, but they weren't effective, as you substantially explained in the book. So can you elaborate on what you mean by this lack of coherent ideology and strategy? And basically, my last $1 million question is, can you give more insight for what could be look like a coherent ideology that results in a substantial change after a protest movement?
Yeah, I mean, you pushed me back towards Lenin earlier in the conversation. I'll go there again. The bumper sticker version of this in the 20th century revolutionary tradition is there is no revolutionary movement without a revolutionary theory. Again, this is the kind of thing that you can call Leninist, but I think it would also, if Lenin hadn't said it, it would be just considered common sense political practice. And it was probably rejected by certain movements in the early 21st century just because Lenin said it. I think if he hadn't said it, everyone would be like, yeah, that makes kind of sense. And another thing that Lenin said in the same time period is that a purely spontaneous, but what he said is that a purely spontaneous uprising will simply reproduce the already existing society, because any ruling class has the means at its disposal to propagate its own ideology and to defend its own ideology and to maintain itself in power. If it did not, it wouldn't be there in the first place. So if you just simply get everybody very mad about something and then react against that thing, you will end up, if you get everybody joining that movement, there will not be a new set of theories or a new set of understandings that will replace the dominant ones in a given society. And in the 2010s, you had a mix of things. You had some people with a very coherent ideology and a very coherent strategy that were either drowned out or were unable to act because they were in the minority and they were not in close coordination with all of the sort of regular people, because regular people are usually probably not going to sit around all day hammering out revolutionary theories, and that's fine, but you need to be in contact with them if you're going to get anything done. So in some cases you had people with a strong ideology, well elaborated, even quite intelligent strategic analysis, that failed to act decisively because things came together too quickly. There was no means of coordinating with the people that joined very quickly, or they were not, basically no one knew who they were, cared about them. They were just over there with their little theories. In other cases, you had people very loudly proclaiming, "We don't have an ideology, and that's good." So if you stand for nothing, then you stand for the power that will be imposed upon you, the ideology that will be imposed upon you. And then in other cases, I think you did see the confusion of tactics and strategy. You saw something that apparently worked so well over there that we just do that exact same thing here and we'll win. Occupy Wall Street in the United States was an attempt in Manhattan to do Tahrir Square, which was a copy, it was inspired by something that had worked in central Cairo, and Egypt itself was inspired by what had happened in Tunisia. By 2014 in Hong Kong, you get the reproduction of the Occupy tactic, which was copied, and by then it had already become clear that actually that thing didn't work out so well for transforming Egyptian society. But there was the reproduction of the thing that had generated a lot of media. It gets a lot of attention going, but there was a confusion of that attention.
Thank you so much, Vincent, again. And I had a great time. I hope you had. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking to me and for having me here in Birmingham.